What can nature teach us about healing? First of all, let's have a look at how we are currently doing. Globally, 1 in 3 adults suffer from multiple chronic diseases. And if you're from a developed country, unfortunately, the picture is even more bleak. So if you go out to the street or in a nearby store, out of the 4 people that you will see, 3 of them will have multiple chronic diseases. Probably you will agree that the picture is pretty bleak. But let's look at where are we heading. The World Health Organization predicts an increase of 90% of chronic disease deaths by 2050. There are many statistics about various chronic diseases that honestly paint quite a poor outlook about our health. For example, the cancer rates are predicted to increase like wildfire. 1 in 5 men and 1 in 5 women will have cancer by 2050. Anxiety is on the rise, depression is on the rise, and so many other chronic conditions that we could spend the whole video just narrating them. So as we can see, we are witnessing a general deterioration in our health. I think we can all agree that chronic diseases seem to be spreading like wildfire. Something is off, right? We're investing so much resources, time, energy, research for various decades in our battle for chronic diseases. And yet, it's not just that we are not slowing them down, we are speeding them up. So we are missing something. It seems that doing the same effort in the same directions as we have been doing for the past few decades, it's not bringing us the desired results. So let's see what nature can teach us about healing. Probably you are familiar with Yellowstone National Park. It was one of the first national parks ever established, if not the first one. So when the settlers arrived there, they were just astonished by the beauty of nature. And the native people were living there for about 10 or 11,000 years by that time in peace with nature. And we were so thrilled how amazing it is that we decided to protect it. So we established a national park to protect the natural environment. And we encountered our first problem, the wolf. So the wolf is obviously a predator, and we had our cattle that we needed to protect. So we had a problem, the wolf, and we needed a solution. And our solution was to kill the wolves. We have been killing the wolves not for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years. We have been killing them for decades, literally for 50 or 60 years, until some alarm bells start ringing. Let's see what a team of scientists had to say. The range was in deplorable conditions when we first saw it, and its deterioration has been progressing steadily since then. The park was literally dying in front of our eyes, so we have a really ginormous problem to solve. So again, we had a problem and we needed a solution. And we figured out what is the problem. The problem were the elks. We find out that the responsible for the erosion of nature was the overgrazing of the elks. So we decided to fix the problem and solve it by displacing the elks or killing them. So that was our solution. And so we were killing the elks for another few decades until in the 60s. So this was about 100 years that we were killing the wolf and a few decades that we were killing the elks, that the hunters start to complain that there were too few elks, and the congressmen put pressure on the Yellowstone Park to stop killing the elks, if not they will withdraw their funds. The Yellowstone Park decided to stop killing the elks, and at that time system science became more prevalent. We will not go in depth what is system science. Basically, the realization that life systems like we humans and the environment, are complex dynamic systems. It means that we cannot just isolate a piece and regard it in its isolation. That will, by default, have a smaller or bigger rippling effect in all the other elements in the system. I will put a slide on the screen if you want to pause it and read about it a bit more. So we decided to give it a try and import about 10 or 15 friendly wolves from Canada and let them roam freely through the park. And what we have found out 30 years later was stunning. Once we start to work with nature and not against it, meaning we acknowledge its complexity, in its interconnectedness and the dynamic balance that is going on, so we were not trying to enforce something against the natural principles, but work with the natural principles. And the results were extremely positive. So what we have seen is that the vegetation restarted to grow, there were more bushes, there were more berries, therefore there were more birds, there were more beavers, they were making more dams in the rivers, so there were more fishes, etc. You got the point. The whole ecosystem, once we acknowledge how it's working, it starts to heal itself and regain its original balance. This was our experience in the Yellowstone Park. So now the question arises, what we can learn from it, meaning what was the main problem? Let's take a few seconds to think about it. Was the main problems that we were killing the wolves, that we were killing the elks? The main problem was much deeper than that. The main problem was our perception. Basically, our perception was distorted and we perceived things as separable, which is obviously not true. It's disconnected from reality. Things are not separable, whether philosophically, scientifically, socially, biologically, psychologically, ecologically, as we have seen. The reality is that we are interconnected, complex systems, so we cannot just split some aspects and in isolation and tackle them as if they will not affect all the other elements interconnected in the system. For example, in the sphere of our health, we cannot separate one organ or one system from the other, whether it's like tackling the cardiovascular system disregarded from the hormone system or from the respiratory system, etc. But also we cannot disconnect, perhaps even more importantly, our physical system or physical level from our emotional level or our mental level. We cannot separate how it will influence our health, the patterns of our parents or their trauma that we know by now it's also inherited. So we are a net of relationships. Everything is interconnected, and if we overlook this, we will simply not be able to solve the problem because we cannot even frame the problem. For the matter of fact, the way how we were solving the problem, for example, in Yellowstone, and as we are doing with our health currently as well mainly, it's causing more problems down the road instead of improving things. To summarize what we can learn from the Yellowstone example, that we can totally extrapolate in what we can learn in how we are currently approaching our own health, it's a misunderstanding of what the problem is. In the Yellowstone example, for example, almost 100 years, we didn't realize that our solution were creating a much bigger problem. When we killed the wolves or the elks, we were fully convinced we are solving the problem. Any relationship to health issues and our approach to them? This is perhaps the most important part, right? That our perception of reality prevented us from connecting the dots and therefore be able to solve the problems. And unfortunately, our approach was degrading the very environment our life depends on, without us even noticing. What can nature teach us about healing? As we have seen, a shift in perception is essential. And we have to focus primarily on two main aspects. The first one is the interconnectedness. If we overlook the interconnectedness of our physical, emotional, and mental states and try to isolate the problem, whether that it's stomachache or headache, skin eczema, allergy, migraines, we will simply not be able to solve it in the long term because we are disregarding the very nature of the system that we are trying to fix. We need a shift in perspective. We need to move from the extremely outdated and, as we have seen, really unrealistic reductionistic approach that focuses primarily on physical symptoms and relies solely on biomedical explanations to a more interconnected approach that it's more true to the reality of the complex systems that we are, and view health as a holistic concept which encompasses physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual aspects. We are not a machine where we can isolate a piece and tackle it without having a rippling effect in the vast net of interconnected relationships that forms us humans. And as it's known in homeopathy for a few hundred of years, and right now science it's confirming for the last few decades, symptoms can arise on any level and originate from any other level. Which brings us to the second point, that we have to acknowledge the dynamic balance that it's constantly going on. What that means, as we have seen in the Yellowstone example, it may take us decades, or in the wolf case 100 years, to understand that by overlooking this fragile balance that the natural system, whether nature or our body, it's trying to maintain, and if we are just aggressively attacking it, we may be causing a gradual deterioration, which is not really glaring and goes gradually, and it takes us a lot of time to notice that we are creating a very deep systemic imbalance. Whether in Yellowstone, right, that we have seen the collapse of the ecosystem, in the same way we are seeing, as we mentioned at the beginning of the video, a general deterioration of human health. As we have mentioned, the main problem is that we try to isolate one aspect out from the complexity of a dynamic system and address it in isolation, disregarding the effect that it has on the whole system. In the Yellowstone example, that was the killing of wolf and elks, which creates gradually a systemic imbalance. And as we see in human health, symptomatic treatment, just tackling the stomachache, the skin condition, the head pain, in isolation, down the road, gradually disrupts the balance and generates chronic conditions. For example, how this looked like in the Yellowstone Park. First, we have the wolf removal that created an elk overpopulation, which generated vegetation loss, then animal loss, following by soil erosion, water quality decline, and finally with a complete ecosystem fragmentation. So we see how step by step, not really glaringly, the system was imbalanced and started to deteriorate. Since we are nature, the same laws that apply to nature apply also to ourselves. Of course, this is a very general representation just to convey the main point. It would need much more detail and explanation. We can do perhaps this in another video. So in a human example, that would be we have a skin rash when we are 7 years old and we address it with a symptomatic treatment. And then a year later, we develop allergies. We address them symptomatically again, and we develop digestive issues, again addressed in isolation symptomatically, and they are followed by headaches, which again are addressed symptomatically, and we develop finally chronic gastritis that we have seen it's a much deeper imbalance. It disturbs our life quality much more. which it addressed symptomatically, and then we start to have depression and soon after poor concentration. We can see if we address things in isolation, disregarding the interconnectedness and dynamic balance, we will gradually cause a systemic imbalance that may not be so glaring at first, but eventually down the line, if we work against the natural system, as we have seen in Yellowstone Park, we will not bring positive results. We have to start to work with the system and acknowledge its interconnected complexity. The Yellowstone ecosystem didn't collapse overnight. The signs were there, right? We just didn't know how to read them. And we do the exact same thing with our health. We isolate symptoms, suppress signals, and miss the bigger picture. But when we treat parts in isolation, we weaken the whole, because health isn't made of separated pieces. It's the expression of a living, intelligent system. Therefore, true healing begins when we stop isolating and start listening to the whole. Thanks for joining me on this journey. If you have any other questions, you can forward them to me. And if you are interested to know how we can heal better, you can watch the next video. And until the next time, stay curious and take care.